evening. I hope everyone is doing well on this lovely Thursday. And I hope that you are having a safe and productive week. It is starting to warm up. It is starting to get... we're finally making it through allergy season. We're almost done. So hopefully I'll stop being froggy soon. Yeah. And we are continuing with The King in Yellow, the Demoiselle, Demoiselle Dix, I think is what the name of the short story is that we're on right now. So, I guess there is no further ado needed. Let's get into it. 2. I awoke next morning with the music of the horn in my ears, and leaping out of the ancient bed went to a curtained window where the sunlight filtered through little deep-set panes. The horn ceased as I looked into the court below. A man, who might have been brother to the 2 falconers of the night before, stood in the midst of a pack of hounds. A curved horn was strapped over his back, and in his hand he held a long-lashed whip. The dogs whined and yelped, dancing around him in anticipation, and there was the stamp of horses, too, in the walled yard. "Mount!" cried a voice in Breton, and with a clatter of hoofs the 2 falconers, with falcons upon their wrists, rode into the courtyard among the hounds. Then I heard another voice, which sent the blood throbbing through my heart. "Pere you, Louis, hunt the hounds well, and spare neither spur nor whip. Thou, Raoul, and thou, Gaston, see that the Epervier does not prove himself niais, and if it be best in your judgment, fais courtoisie à l'oiseau. Jardiner un oiseau like the mure there on Hastur's wrist is not difficult, but thou, Raoul, mayst not find it so simple to govern that haggard. Twice last week he foamed au vif, and lost the becade, although he is used to the lure. The bird acts like a stupid banchier. Paître un haggard n'est pas si facile." Was I dreaming? The old language of falconry which I had read in yellow manuscripts, the old forgotten French of the Middle Ages, was sounding in my ears while the hounds bayed and the hawks' bells tinkled accompaniment to the stamping horses. She spoke again in the sweet forgotten language. "If you would rather attach the longe and leave the haggard au bloc, Raoul, I will say nothing, for it were a pity to spoil so fair a day's sport with an ill-trained saw. Est-ce abaisser? It is possibly the best way. Salut, donnera, terrain. Oh, I was perhaps hasty with the bird. It takes time to pass à la filière, and the exercises d'escape." There's a lot of French in this part. Then the falconer Raoul bowed in his stirrups and replied, "If it be the pleasure of Mademoiselle, I shall keep the hawk." "It is my wish," she answered. "Falconry I know, but you have yet to give me many a lesson in artillerie, my poor Raoul. Père Louis, mount." The huntsman sprang into an archway and in an instant returned, mounted upon a strong black horse, followed by a piqueur also mounted. "Aha!" she cried joyously. "Speed, Glamorrenet! Speed, speed all! Sound thy horn, Sire Périlleux!" The silvery music of the hunting horn filled the courtyard. The hounds sprang through the gateway, and galloping hoofbeats plunged out of the paved court, loud on the drawbridge, suddenly muffled, then lost in the heather and bracken of the moors. Distant and more distant sounded the horn until it became so faint that the sudden carol of a soaring lark drowned it in my ears. I heard the voice below responding to some call from within the house. "I do not regret the chase. I will go another time. Courtesy to the stranger, Pelagie, remember." And a feeble voice came quavering from within. "Courtesy." I stripped and rubbed myself from head to foot in the huge earthen basin of icy water which stood upon the stone floor at the foot of my bed. Then I looked about for my clothes. They were gone, but on a settle near the door lay a heap of garments which I inspected with astonishment. As my clothes had vanished, I was compelled to attire myself in the costume which had evidently been placed there for me to wear while my own clothes dried. Everything was there. Cap, shoes, and hunting doublet of a silvery grey homespun, but the close-fitting costumes and seamless shoes belonged to another century, and I remembered the strange costumes of the 3 falconers in the courtyard. I was sure that it was not the modern dress of any portion of France or Brittany, but not until I was dressed and stood before a mirror between the windows did I realize that I was clothed much more like a young huntsman of the Middle Ages than like a Breton of that day. I hesitated and picked up the cap. Should I go down and present myself in that strange guise? There seemed to be no help for it. My own clothes were gone, and there was no bell in the ancient chamber to call a servant, so I contented myself with removing a short hawk's feather from the cap, and opening the door, went downstairs. By the fireplace in the large room at the foot of the stairs, an old Breton woman sat spinning with a distaff. She looked up at me when I appeared, and smiling frankly, wished me health in the Breton language, to which I laughingly replied in French. At the same moment my hostess appeared and returned my salutation with a grace and dignity that sent a thrill to my heart. Her lovely head, with its dark, curly hair, was crowned with a headdress which set all doubts as to the epoch of my own costume at rest. Her slender figure was exquisitely set off in the homespun hunting gown edged with silver, and on her gauntlet-covered wrist she bore one of her petted hawks. With perfect simplicity she took my hand and led me into the garden and the court, and seating herself before a table, invited me very sweetly to sit beside her. Then she asked me in her soft, quaint accent how I had passed the night, and whether I was very much inconvenienced by wearing the clothes which old Pelagie had put there for me while I slept. I looked at my own clothes and shoes drying in the sun by the garden wall, and hated them. What horrors they were compared with the graceful costume which I now wore. I told her this laughing, and she agreed with me very seriously. "We will throw them away," she said in a quiet voice. In my astonishment I attempted to explain that I not only could not think of accepting clothes from anybody, although for all I knew it might be the custom of hospitality in that part of the country, but that I should cut an impossible figure if I returned to France clothed as I was then. She laughed and tossed her pretty head, saying something in old French which I did not understand, and then Pelagie trotted out with a tray on which stood 2 bowls of milk, a loaf of white bread, a fruit, a platter of honeycomb, and a flagon of deep red wine. "You see, I have not yet broken my fast because I wished you to eat with me, but I am very hungry," she smiled. "I would rather die than forget one word of what you have said," I blurted out while my cheeks burned. "She will think me mad," I added to myself, but she turned to me with sparkling eyes. "Ah!" she murmured, "then monsieur knows all that there is of chivalry." She crossed herself and broke bread, and I sat and watched her white hands, not daring to raise my eyes to her. "Will you not eat?" she asked. "Why do you look so troubled?" Oh, why? I knew it now. I knew I would give my life to touch with my lips those rosy palms. I understood now that from the moment when I looked into her dark eyes there on the moor last night, I had loved her. My great and sudden passion held me speechless. "Are you ill at ease?" she asked again. Then, like a man who pronounces his own doom, I answered in a low voice, "Yes, I am ill at ease for love of you." And as she did not stir nor answer, the same power moved my lips in spite of me, and I said, "I, who am unworthy of the lightest of your thoughts, I who abuse hospitality and repay your gentle courtesy with bold presumption, I love you." She leaned her head upon her hands and answered softly, "I love you. Your words are very dear to me. I love you." "Then I shall win you." "Win me," she replied. But all the time I had been sitting silent, my face turned toward her. She, also silent, her sweet face resting on her upturned palm, sat facing me, and as her eyes looked into mine, I knew that neither she nor I had spoken human speech, but I knew that her soul had answered mine, and I drew myself up feeling youth and joyous love coursing through every vein. She, with a bright color in her lovely face, seemed as one awakened from a dream, and her eyes sought mine with a questioning glance which made me tremble with delight. We broke our fast, speaking of ourselves. I told her my name, and she told me hers, the Demoiselle Gentille. She spoke of her father and mother's death, and how the 19 of her years had been passed in the little fortified farm alone, with her nurse Pelagie, Glamorec René, the piqueur, and the 4 falconers, Raoul, Gaston, Hastur, and the Sieur Pierreux Louis, who had served her father. She had never been outside the moorland, never even had seen a human soul before except the falconers and Pelagie. She did not know how she had heard of Kerselec. Perhaps the falconers had spoken of it. She knew the legends of Loup-garou and Jean le Flamme from her nurse Pelagie. She embroidered and spun flax. Her hawks and hounds were her only distraction. When she had met me there on the moor, she had been so frightened that she almost dropped at the sound of my voice. She had, it was true, seen ships at sea from the cliffs, but as far as the eyes could reach, the moors over which she galloped were destitute of any sign of human life. There was a legend which old Pelagie told, how anybody once lost in the unexplored moorland might never return because the moors were enchanted. She did not know whether it was true. She never had thought about it until she met me. She did not know whether the falconers had even been outside, or whether they could go if they would. The books in the house which Pelagie the nurse had taught her to read were hundreds of years old. All this she told me with a sweet seriousness seldom seen in anyone but children. My own name she found easy to pronounce, and insisted, because my first name was Philip, I must have French blood in me. She did not seem curious to learn anything about the outside world, and I thought perhaps she considered it had forfeited her interest and respect from the stories of her nurse. We were still sitting at the table, and she was throwing grapes to the small field birds which came fearlessly to our very feet. I began to speak, in a vague way, of going. She would not hear of it, and before I knew it I had promised to stay a week and hunt with hawk and hound in their company. I also obtained permission to come again from Kerselec and visit her after my return. "Why," she said innocently, "I do not know what I should do if you never came back." And I, knowing that I had no right to awaken her with the sudden shock which the avowal of my own love would bring to her, sat silent, hardly daring to breathe. "You will come very often?" she asked. "Very often," I said. "Every day?" "Every day." "Oh," she sighed, "I am very happy. Come and see my hawks." She rose and took my hand again with a childlike innocence of possession, and we walked through the garden and fruit trees to a grassy lawn which was bordered by a brook. Over the lawn were scattered 15 or 20 stumps of trees partially embedded in the grass, and upon all of these except 2 sat falcons. They were attached to the stumps by thongs which were in turn fastened with steel rivets to their legs just above the talons. A little stream of pure spring water flowed in a winding course within easy distance of each perch. The birds set up a clamor when the girl appeared, but she went from one to another, caressing some, taking others for an instant upon her wrist, or stooping to adjust their jesses. "Are they not pretty?" she said. "See, here is a falcon genteel. We call it ignoble because it takes the quarry in direct chase. This is a blue falcon. In falconry we call it noble because it rises over the quarry and, wheeling, drops upon it from below. This white bird is a gerfalcon from the north. It is also noble. Here is a merlin, and this tierclet is a falcon heroner." I asked her how she had learned the old language of falconry. She did not remember, but thought her father must have taught it to her when she was very young. Then she led me away and showed me the young falcons still in the nest. "They are termed niais in falconry," she explained. "A branchier is the young bird which is just able to leave the nest and hop from branch to branch. A young bird which is not yet molted is called a sourd, and a muet is a hawk which has molted in captivity. When we catch a wild falcon which has changed its plumage, we term it a garde. Raoul first taught me to dress a falcon. Shall I teach you how it is done?" She seated herself on the bank of the stream among the falcons, and I threw myself at her feet to listen. Then the Demoiselle held up one rosy-tipped finger and began very gravely. "First, one must catch the falcon." "I am caught," I answered. She laughed very prettily and told me my dressage would perhaps be difficult as I was noble. "I am already tamed," I replied, "just and belled." She laughed, delighted. "Oh, my brave falcon, then will you return at my call?" "I am yours," I answered gravely. She sat silent for a moment. Then the color heightened in her cheeks, and she held up her finger again, saying, "Listen, I wish to speak of falconry." "I listen, Countess Gendy." But again she fell into the reverie, and her eyes seemed fixed on something beyond the summer clouds. "Philip," she said at last. "Jean," I whispered. "That is all. That is what I wished," she sighed. "Philip and Jean." She held her hand toward me, and I touched it with my lips. "Win me," she said, but this time it was the body and soul which spoke in unison. After a while she began again. "Let us speak of falconry." "Begin," I replied. "We have caught the falcon." Then Jean d'Ys took my hand in both of hers and told me how with infinite patience the young falcon was taught to perch upon the wrist, how little by little it became used to the belled jesses and the chaperon à cornette. "They must first have a good appetite," she said. "Then little by little I reduced their nourishment, which in falconry we call pâte. When after many nights passed au bloc as these birds are now, I prevail upon the agard to stay quietly on the wrist, then the bird is ready to be taught to come for its food. I fix the pâte to the end of the thong or lure, and teach the bird to come to me as soon as I begin to whirl the cord in circles about my head. At first I drop the pâte when the falcon comes, and he eats the food on the ground. After a little while, he will learn to seize the lure in motion as I whirl it around my head or drag it over the ground. After this, it is easy to teach the falcon to strike at game, always remembering to faire courtesy à l'oiseau, that is, to allow the bird to take the quarry." A squeal from one of the falcons interrupted her, and she arose to adjust the longe which had become whipped about the block, but the bird still flapped its wings and screamed. "What is the matter?" she said. "Philip, can you see?" I looked around and at first saw nothing to cause the commotion, which was now heightened by the screams and flapping of all the birds. Then my eye fell upon the flat rock beside the stream from which the girl had risen. A gray serpent was moving slowly across the surface of the boulder, and the eyes in its flat triangular head sparkled like a jet. "A kolov," I don't know how to pronounce that word. Kolov, she said quietly. "It is harmless, is it not?" She pointed to the black V-shaped figure on the neck. "It is certain death," she said. "It is a viper." We watched the reptile moving slowly over the smooth rock to where the sunlight fell in a broad, warm patch. I started forward to examine it, but she clung to my arm, crying, "Don't, Philip! I'm afraid." "For me?" "For you, Philip. I love you." Then I took her in my arms and kissed her on the lips, but all I could say was Jean, 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 and as she lay, trembling on my breast, something struck my foot in the grass below, but I did not heed it. Then again something struck my ankle, and a sharp pain shot through me. I looked into the sweet face of Jeanne d'Ys and kissed her, and with all my strength lifted her in my arms and flung her from me. Then, bending, I tore the viper from my ankle and set my heel upon its head. I remember feeling weak and numb. I remember falling to the ground. Though my slowly gazing eyes, I saw Jean's white face bending close to mine, and when the light in my eyes went out, I still felt her arms about my neck and her soft cheek against my drawn lips. When I opened my eyes, I looked around in terror. Jeanne was gone. I saw the stream and the flat rock. I saw the crushed viper in the grass beside me, but the hawks and blocks had disappeared. I sprang to my feet. The garden, the fruit trees, the drawbridge, and the walled court were gone. I stared stupidly at a heap of crumbling ruins, ivy-covered and gray, through which great trees had pushed their way. I crept forward, dragging my numbed foot, and as I moved, a falcon sailed from the treetops among the ruins and soaring, mounting in narrowing circles, faded and vanished in the clouds above. "Jeanne! Jeanne!" I cried, but my voice died on my lips, and I fell on my knees among the weeds, and as God willed it, I, not knowing, had fallen, kneeling before a crumbling shrine carved in stone for our Mother of Sorrows. I saw the sad face of the Virgin wrought in the cold stone. I saw the cross and thorns at her feet, and beneath it I read, "Pray for the soul of Demoiselle Jeanne d'Ys, who died in her youth for love of Philip, a stranger, A.D. 1573. But upon the icy slab lay a woman's glove, still warm and fragrant. The Prophet's Paradise. If but the vine and love abjuring band are in the Prophet's paradise to stand, alack, I doubt the Prophet's paradise were empty as the hollow of one's hand. The studio. He smiled, saying, "Seek her throughout the world." I said, "Why tell me of the world? My world is here, between these walls and the sheet of glass above, here among gilded flagons and dull jeweled arms, tarnished frames and canvases, black chests and high-backed chairs, quaintly carved and stained in blue and gold." "For whom do you wait?" he said, and I answered, "When she comes I shall know her." On my hearth a tongue of flame whispered secrets to the whitening ashes. In the street below I heard footsteps, a voice and a song. "For whom then do you wait?" he said, and I answered, "I shall know her." Footsteps, a voice, and a song in the street below. I knew the song, but neither the steps nor the voice. "Fool!" he cried. "The song is the same, the voice and steps have but changed with years." On the hearth a tongue of flame whispered above the whitening ashes, "Wait no more. They have passed, the steps and the voice in the street below." Then he smiled, saying, "For whom do you wait? Seek her throughout the world." I answered, "My world is here, between these walls and the sheet of glass above, here, among gilded flagons and dull-jeweled arms, tarnished frames and canvases, black chests and high-backed chairs, quaintly carved and stained in blue and gold." The Phantom. The phantom of the past would go no further. "If it is true," she sighed, "that you find in me a friend, let us turn back together. You will forget here under the summer sky." I held her close, pleading, caressing. I seized her, white with anger, but she resisted. "If it is true," she sighed, "that you find in me a friend, let us turn back together." The phantom of the past would go no further. the sacrifice. I went into a field of flowers whose petals are whiter than snow and whose hearts are pure gold. Far afield a woman cried, "I have killed him I loved!" And from a jar she poured blood upon the flowers whose petals are whiter than snow and whose hearts are pure gold. Far afield I followed, and on the jar I read 1,000 names, while from within the fresh blood bubbled to the brim. "I have killed him I loved!" she cried. "The world's athirst, now let it drink!" She passed, and far afield I watched her pouring blood upon the flowers whose petals are whiter than snow and whose hearts are pure gold. Destiny. I came to the bridge which few may pass. "Pass!" cried the keeper, but I laughed, saying, "There is time," and he smiled and shut the gates. To the bridge which few may pass came young and old, all were refused. Idly I stood and counted them until, wearied of their noise and lamentations, I came again to the bridge which few may pass. Those in the throng about the gate shrieked out, "He comes too late!" But I laughed, saying, "There is time." "Pass!" cried the keeper as I entered, then smiled and shut the gates. The throng. There, where the throng was thickest in the street, I stood with Pierrot. All eyes were turned on me. "What are they laughing at?" I asked, but he grinned, dusting the chalk from my black cloak. "I cannot see. It must be something droll, perhaps an honest thief." All eyes were turned on me. "He has robbed you of your purse," they laughed. "My purse!" I cried. "Pierrot, help! It is a thief!" They laughed. "He has robbed you of your purse!" Then Truth stepped out, holding a mirror. "If he is an honest thief," cried Truth, "Pierrot shall find him with this mirror." But he only grinned, dusting the chalk from my black cloak. "You see," he said, "Truth is an honest thief. She brings you back your mirror." All eyes were turned on me. "Arrest Truth!" I cried, forgetting it was not a mirror but a purse I lost, standing with Pierrot there where the throng was thickest in the street. The jester. "Was she fair?" I asked, but he only chuckled, listening to the bells jingling on his cap. "Stabbed," he tittered. "Think of the long journey, the days of peril, the dreadful nights. Think how he wandered for her sake year after year through hostile lands, yearning for kith and kin, yearning for her. Stabbed," he tittered, listening to the bells jingling on his cap. "Was she fair?" I asked, but he only snarled, muttering to the bells jingling on his cap. "She kissed him at the gate," he tittered, "but in the hall his brother's welcome touched his heart." "Was she fair?" I asked. "Stabbed," he chuckled. "Think of the long journey, the days of peril, the dreadful nights. Think how he wandered for her sake year after year through hostile lands, yearning for kith and kin, yearning for her. She kissed him at the gate, but in the hall his brother's welcome touched his heart." "Was she fair?" I asked, but he only snarled, listening to the bells jingling in his cap. The green room. The clown turned his powdered face to the mirror. "If to be fair is to be beautiful," he said, "who can compare with me and my white mask?" "Who can compare with him and his white mask?" I asked of Death beside me. "Who can compare with me?" said Death, "for I am paler still." "You are very beautiful," sighed the clown, turning his powdered face from the mirror. The love test. "If it is true that you love," said Love, "then wait no longer. Give her these jewels which would dishonor her, and so dishonor you in loving one dishonored. If it is true that you love," said Love, "then wait no longer." I took the jewels and went to her, but she trod upon them, sobbing, "Teach me to wait. I love you." "Then wait, if it is true," said Love. We have another short story with French in the beginning, so I will attempt with my poor understanding of French. The Street of the Four Winds. Vingt-deux à demi, croix des bras sur ton sein, et de ton cœur endormi, chasse à jamais, tout dessin, je chante la nature, la toile de soie, les larmes du matin, les couchers des soleils à l'horizon, lointain, le ciel qui parlait à cœur d'existence future. 1. The animal paused on the threshold, interrogative alert, ready for flight if necessary. Severn laid down his palette and held out a hand of welcome. The cat remained motionless, her yellow eyes fastened upon Severn. "Puss," he said in his low, pleasant voice, "come in." The tip of her thin tail twitched uncertainly. "Come in," he said again. Apparently she found his voice reassuring, for she slowly settled upon all fours, her eyes still fastened upon him, her tail tucked under her gaunt flanks. He rose from his easel smiling. She eyed him quietly, and when he walked toward her, she watched him bend above her without a wince. Her eyes followed his hand until it touched her head. Then she uttered a ragged mew. It had long been Severn's custom to converse with animals, perhaps because he lived so much alone, and now he said, "What's the matter, Puss?" Her timid eyes sought his. "I understand," he said gently. "You shall have it at once." Then, moving quietly, he busied himself with the duties of a host, rinsed a saucer, filled it with the rest of the milk from the bottle on the window-sill, and kneeling down, crumbled a roll into the hollow of his hand. The creature rose and crept toward the saucer. With the handle of the palette knife, he stirred the crumbs and milk together and stepped back as she thrust her nose into the mess. He watched her in silence. From time to time the saucer clinked upon the tiled floor as she reached for a morsel on the rim, and at last the bread was all gone and her purple tongue traveled over every unlicked spot until the saucer shone like polished marble. Then she sat up, and coolly turning her back to him, began her ablutions. "Keep it up," said Severn, much interested. "You need it." She flattened one ear, but neither turned nor interrupted her toilette. As the grime was slowly removed, Severn observed that nature had intended her for a white cat. Her fur had disappeared in patches from disease or the chances of war, her tail was bony and her spine sharp. But what charms she had were becoming apparent under vigorous licking, and he waited until she had finished before reopening the conversation. When at last she closed her eyes and folded her forepaws under her breast, he began again very gently, "Puss, tell me your troubles." At the sound of his voice she broke into a harsh rumbling which he recognized as an attempt to purr. He bent over her to rub her cheek, and she mewed again, an amiable, inquiring little mew, to which he replied, "Certainly, you are greatly improved, and when you recover your plumage, you will be a gorgeous bird." Much flattered, she stood up and marched around and around his legs, pushing her head between them and making pleased remarks, to which he responded with grave politeness. "Now, what sent you here?" he said. "Here into the Street of the Four Winds and up 5 flights to the very door where you would be welcome. What was it that prevented your premeditated flight when I turned from my canvas to encounter your yellow eyes? Are you a Latin Quarter cat, as I am a Latin Quarter man? And why do you wear a rose-colored flowered garter buckled about your neck?" The cat had climbed into his lap and now sat purring as he passed his hand over her thin coat. "Excuse me," he continued in lazy, soothing tones, harmonizing with her purring, "if I seem indelicate, but I cannot help musing on this rose-colored garter, flowered so quaintly and fastened with a silver clasp. For the clasp is silver. I can see the mint mark on the edge, as is prescribed by the law of the French Republic. Now, why is this garter woven of rose silk and delicately embroidered? Why is this silken garter with its silver clasp about your famished throat? Am I indiscreet when I inquire if its owner is your owner? Is she some aged dame living in memory of youthful vanities, fond, doting on you, decorating you with her intimate personal attire. The circumference of the garter would suggest this, for your neck is thin and the garter fits you. But then again I notice most things, that the garter is capable of being much enlarged. Those small silver-rimmed eyelets, of which I count 5, are proof of that. And now I observe that the 5th eyelet is worn out, as though the tongue of the clasp were accustomed to lie there. That seems to argue a well-rounded form. The cat curled her toes in contentment. The street was very still outside. He murmured on. Why should your mistress decorate you with an article most necessary to her at all times? Well, anyway, at most times. How did she come to slip this bit of silk and silver about your neck? Was it the caprice of the moment when you, before you had lost your pristine plumpness, marched singing into her bedroom to bid her good morning? Of course, and she sat up among her pillows, her coiled hair tumbling to her shoulders, as you sprang upon the bed, purring, "Good day, my lady." Oh, it is very easy to understand. He yawned, resting his head on the back of the chair. The cat still purred, tightening and relaxing her padded claws over his knee. Shall I tell you about her, cat? She's very beautiful, your mistress, he murmured drowsily, and her hair is heavy as burnished gold. I could paint her. Not on canvas, for I should need shades and tones and hues and dyes more splendid than the iris of a splendid rainbow. I could only paint her with closed eyes, for in dreams alone can such colors as I need be found. For her eyes I must have azure from skies untroubled by a cloud, the skies of dreamland. For her lips, roses from the palaces of slumberland, and for her brow, snowdrifts from mountains which tower in fantastic pinnacles to the moons, oh, much higher than our moon here, crystal moons of dreamland. She is very beautiful, your mistress. The words died on his lips, and his eyelids drooped. The cat, too, was asleep. Her cheek turned up upon her wasted flank, her paws relaxed and limp. 2. It is fortunate, said Saverne, sitting up and stretching, that we have tided over the dinner hour, for I have nothing to offer you for supper but what may be purchased with 1 silver franc. The cat on his knee rose, arched her back, yawned, and looked up at him. What shall it be? A roast chicken with salad, no? Possibly you prefer beef? Of course. And I shall try an egg and some white bread. Now for the wines. Milk for you? Good. I shall take a little water, fresh from the wood, with a motion toward the bucket in the sink. He put on his hat and left the room. The cat followed to the door, and after he had closed it behind him, she settled down, smelling at the cracks and cocking one ear at every creak from the crazy old building. The door below opened and shut. The cat looked serious, for a moment doubtful, and her ears flattened in nervous expectation. Presently, she rose with a jerk of her tail and started on a noiseless tour of the studio. She sneezed at a pot of turpentine, hastily retreating to the table, which she presently mounted, and having satisfied her curiosity concerning a roll of red modeling wax, returned to the door and sat down with her eyes on the crack over the threshold. Then she lifted her voice in a thin plaint. When Saverne returned, he looked grave, but the cat, joyous and demonstrative, marched around him, rubbing her gaunt body against his legs, driving her head enthusiastically into his hand, and purring until her voice mounted to a squeal. He placed a bit of meat, wrapped in brown paper, upon the table, and with a penknife cut it into shreds. The milk he took from a bottle which had served for medicine, and poured it into the saucer on the hearth. The cat crouched before it, purring and lapping at the same time. He cooked his egg and ate it with a slice of bread, watching her busy with the shredded meat, and when he had finished and had filled and emptied a cup of water from the bucket in the sink, he sat down, taking her into his lap, where she at once curled up and began her toilet. He began to speak again, touching her caressingly at times by way of emphasis. "Cat, I have found out where your mistress lives. It's not very far away. It's here, under this same leaky roof, but in the north wing, which I had supposed was uninhabited. My janitor tells me this. By chance he is almost sober this evening. The butcher on the Rue de Seine, where I bought your meat, knows you, and old Caban, the baker, identified you with needless sarcasm. They tell me hard tales of your mistress which I shall not believe. They say she's idle and vain and pleasure-loving. They say she's hare-brained and reckless. The little sculptor on the ground floor, who was buying rolls from old Caban, spoke to me tonight for the first time, although we have always bowed to each other. He said she was very good and very beautiful. He's only seen her once, and does not know her name. I thanked him. I don't know why I thanked him so warmly. Caban said, into this cursed street of the four winds blow all things evil. The sculptor looked confused, but when he went out with his rolls, he said to me, I am sure, monsieur, that she is as good as she is beautiful. The cat had finished her toilet, and now, springing softly to the floor, went to the door and sniffed. He knelt beside her, and unclasping the garter, held it for a moment in his hands. After a while he said, There is a name engraved upon the silver clasp beneath the buckle. It is a pretty name, Sylvia Elvin. Sylvia is a woman's name. Elvin is the name of a town. In Paris, in this quarter above all, in this street of the four winds, names are worn and put away as the fashions change with the seasons. I know the little town of Elvin, for there I met Fate face to face, and Fate was unkind. But do you know that in Elvin, Fate had another name, and that name was Sylvia? He replaced the garter and stood up, looking down at the cat crouched before the closed door. The name of Elvin has a charm for me. It tells me of meadows and clear rivers. The name of Sylvia troubles me like perfume from dead flowers. The cat mewed. Yes, yes, he said soothingly. I will take you back. Your Sylvia is not my Sylvia. The world is wide, and Elvin is not unknown. Yet, in the darkness and filth of poorer Paris, and the sad shadows of this ancient house, these names are very pleasant to me. He lifted her in his arms and strode through the silent corridor to the stairs, down 5 flights and into the moonlit court, past the little sculptor's den, and then again, in at the gate of the north wing, and up the worm-eaten stairs he passed until he came to a closed door. When he had stood knocking for a long time, something moved behind the door. It opened, and he went in. The room was dark. As he crossed the threshold, the cat sprang from his arms into the shadows. He listened, but heard nothing. The silence was oppressive, and he struck a match. At his elbow stood a table, and on the table a candle and a gilded candlestick. This he lighted and then looked around. The chamber was vast. The hangings, heavy with embroidery, over the fireplace towered a carved mantel gray with the ashes of dead fires. In a recess by the deep-set window stood a bed from which the bedclothes, soft and fine as lace, trailed to the polished floor. He lifted the candle above his head. A handkerchief lay at his feet. It was faintly perfumed. He turned towards the windows. In front of them was a canapé, and over it were flung pell-mell a gown of silk, a heap of lace-like garments, white and delicate as spider's meshes, long, crumpled gloves, and on the floor beneath, the stockings, the little pointed shoes, and one garter of rosy silk, quaintly flowered and fitted with a silver cap. Wondering, he stepped forward and drew the heavy curtains from the bed. For a moment, the candle flared in his hand, then his eyes met 2 other eyes, wide open, smiling, and the candle flame flashed over hair, heavy as gold. She was pale, but not as white as he. Her eyes were untroubled as a child's, but he stared, trembling from head to foot, while the candle flickered in his hand. At last he whispered, "Sylvia, it is I." Again he said, "It is I." Then, knowing that she was dead, he kissed her on the mouth, and through the long watches of the night the cat purred on his knee, tightening and relaxing her padded claws until the sky paled above the street of the four winds. Okay. Not quite what I was expecting. The Street of the First Shell. Be of good cheer, the sullen month will die, and a young moon requite us by and by. Look, how the old one, meagre, bent, and wan with age and fast, is fainting from the sky. The room was already dark. Okay, we'll get partway through the story. The room was already dark. The high roofs opposite cut off what little remained of the December daylight. The girl drew her chair nearer the window and, choosing a large needle, threaded it, knotting the thread over her fingers. Then she smoothed the baby garment across her knees and, bending, bit off the thread and drew the smaller needle from where it rested in the hem. When she had brushed away the stray threads and bits of lace, she laid it again over her knees caressingly. Then she slipped the threaded needle from her corsage and passed it through a button, but as the button spun down the thread, her hand faltered, the thread snapped, and the button rolled across the floor. She raised her head. Her eyes were fixed on a strip of waning light above the chimneys. From somewhere in the city came sounds like the distant beating of drums, and beyond, far beyond, a vague muttering, now growing, swelling, rumbling in the distance like the pounding of surf upon the rocks, now like the surf again, receding, growling, menacing. The cold had become intense, a bitter, piercing cold which strained and snapped at joist and beam and turned the slush of yesterday to flint. From the street below, every sound broke sharp and metallic. The clatter of sabots, the rattle of shutters, or the rare sound of a human voice. The air was heavy, weighted with the black cold as with a pall. To breathe was painful, to move an effort. In the desolate sky there was something that wearied, in the brooding clouds something that saddened. It penetrated the freezing city cut by the freezing river, the splendid city with its towers and domes, its quays and bridges, and its 1,000 spires. It entered the squares, it seized the avenues and the palaces, stole across bridges, and crept among the narrow streets of the Latin Quarter, gray under the gray of the December sky. Sadness. Utter sadness. A fine, icy sleet was falling, powdering the pavement with a tiny crystalline dust. It sifted against the window panes and drifted in heaps along the sill. The light at the window had nearly failed, and the girl bent low over her work. Presently, she raised her head, brushing the curls from her eyes. "Jack, dearest, don't forget to clean your palette." He said, "All right," and picking up the palette, sat down upon the floor in front of the stove. His head and shoulders were in the shadow, but the firelight fell across his knees and glimmered red on the blade of the palette knife. Full in the firelight beside him stood a colored box. On the lid was carved, J. Trent, École des Beaux-Arts, 1870. The inscription was ornamented with an American and a French flag. The sleet blew against the window panes, covering them with stars and diamonds, and melting from the warmer air within, ran down and froze again in fern-like traceries. A dog whined, and the patter of small paws sounded on the zinc behind the stove. "Jack, dear, do you think Hercules is hungry?" The patter of paws was redoubled behind the stove. "He's whining," she continued nervously, "and if it isn't because he's hungry, it is because—" Her voice faltered. A loud humming filled the air. The windows vibrated. "Oh, Jack," she cried, "another—" But her voice was drowned in the scream of a shell tearing through the clouds overhead. "That is the nearest yet," she murmured. "Oh, no," he answered cheerfully. "It probably fell away over by Montmartre." And as she did not answer, he said again with exaggerated unconcern, "They wouldn't take the trouble to fire at the Latin Quarter. Anyway, they haven't a battery that can hurt it." After a while she spoke up brightly. "Jack, dear, when are you going to take me to see Monsieur West's statues?" "I will bet," he said, throwing down his palette and walking over to the window beside her, "that Colette has been here today." "Why?" she asked, opening her eyes very wide. Then, "Oh, it's too bad. Really, men are tiresome when they think they know everything. And I warn you that if Monsieur West is vain enough to imagine that Colette—" From the north another shell came whistling and quavering through the sky, passing above them with long-drawn screech which left the windows singing. "That," he blurted out, "was too near for comfort." They were silent for a while. Then he spoke again gaily. "Go on, Sylvia, and whither poor West?" But she only sighed. "Oh dear, I can never seem to get used to the shells." He sat down on the arm of the chair beside her. Her scissors fell jingling to the floor, and she tossed the unfinished frock after them, and putting both arms about his neck, drew him down into her lap. "Don't go out tonight, Jack." He kissed her uplifted face. "You know I must. Don't make it hard for me." "But when I hear the shells and know you're out in the city—" "But they all fall in Montmartre." "They may all fall in the Beaux-Arts. You said yourself that 2 struck the Quai d'Orsay." "Mere accident. Jack, have pity on me. Take me with you." "And who will there be to get dinner?" She rose and flung herself on the bed. "Oh, I can't get used to it. And I know you must go, but I beg you not to be late to dinner. If you knew what I suffer. I cannot help it, and you must be patient with me, dear." He said, "It is as safe there as it is in our own house." She watched him fill for her the alcohol lamp, and when he had lighted it and had taken his hat to go, she jumped up and clung to him in silence. After a moment he said, "Now, Sylvia, remember my courage is sustained by yours. Come, I must go." She did not move, and he repeated, "I must go." Then she stepped back, and he thought she was going to speak and waited, but she only looked at him, and a little impatiently he kissed her again, saying, "Don't worry, dearest." When he had reached the last flight of stairs on his way to the street, a woman hobbled out of the housekeeper's lodge, waving a letter and calling, "Monsieur Jack! Monsieur Jack! This was a letter left by Monsieur Falleby." He took the letter and, leaning on the threshold of the lodge, read it. "Dear Jack, I believe Braith is dead broke, and I'm sure Falleby is. Braith swears he isn't, and Falleby swears he is, so you can draw your own conclusions. I've got a scheme for a dinner, and if it works, I will let you fellows in. Yours faithfully, West. P.S. Falleby has shaken Hartman and his gang. Thank the Lord, there is something rotten there, or it may be he's only a miser. P.P.S. I'm more desperately in love than ever, but I'm sure she does not care a straw for me." "All right," said Trent with a smile to the concierge. "But tell me, how is Papa Cottard?" The old woman shook her head and pointed to the curtained bed in the lodge. "Père Cottard," he cried cheerily, "how goes the wound today?" He walked over to the bed and drew the curtains. An old man was lying among the tumbled sheets. "Better?" smiled Trent. "Better," repeated the man wearily, and after a pause, "Have you any news, Monsieur Jack?" "I haven't been out today. I will bring you any rumor I may hear, though goodness knows I've got enough of rumors," he muttered to himself. Then aloud, "Cheer up, you're looking better. And the sortie?" "Oh, the sortie? That's for this week. General Trochu sent orders last night." "It will be terrible." "It will be sickening," thought Trent as he went out into the street and turned the corner toward the Rue de Seine. Slaughter, slaughter, phew! Glad I'm not going. The street was almost deserted. A few women muffled in tattered military capes crept along the frozen pavement, and wretchedly clad gaimen hovered over the sewer hole on the corner of the boulevard. A rope around his waist held his rags together. From the rope hung a rat, still warm and bleeding. "There's another in there," he yelled at Trent. "I hit him, but he got away." Trent crossed the street and asked, "How much?" 2 francs for a quarter of a fat one. That's what they give at the Saint-Germain market." A violent fit of coughing interrupted him, but he wiped his face with the palm of his hand and looked cunningly at Trent. "Last week you could buy a rat for 6 francs, but," and here he swore vilely, "the rats have quit the Rue de Seine, and they kill them now over by the new hospital. I'll let you have this for 7 francs. I can sell it for 10 in the Isle Saint Louis." "You lie," said Trent, "and let me tell you that if you try to swindle anybody in this quarter, the people will make short work of you and your rats." He stood a moment eyeing the gayman, who pretended to snivel. Then he tossed him a franc, laughing. The child caught it, and thrusting it into his mouth, wheeled about to the sewer hole. For a second he crouched, motionless, alert, his eyes on the bars of the drain, then leaping forward, he hurled a stone into the gutter, and Trent left him to finish a fierce grey rat that writhed squealing at the mouth of the sewer. "Suppose Braith should come to that," he thought. "Poor little chap." And hurrying, he turned into the dirty passage de Beaux-Arts and entered the 3rd house to the left. "Monsieur is at home?" quavered the old concierge. Home. A garret absolutely bare save for the iron bedstead in the corner and the iron basin and pitcher on the floor. West appeared at the door, winking with much mystery, and motioned Trent to enter. Braith, who was painting in bed to keep warm, looked up, laughed, and shook hands. "Any news?" The perfunctory question was answered as usual by nothing but the cannon. Trent sat down on the bed. "Where on earth did you get that?" he demanded, pointing to a half-finished chicken nestling in a wash-basin. West grinned. "Are you millionaires, you two? Out with it!" Braith, looking a little ashamed, began, "Oh, it's one of West's exploits," but was cut short by West, who said he would tell the story himself. "You see, before the siege I had a letter of introduction to a type here, a fat banker, German-American variety. You know the species, I see. Well, of course, I forgot to present the letter, but this morning, judging it to be a favorable opportunity, I called on him. The villain lives in comfort. Fires, my boy, fires in the ante-rooms. The Buttons finally condescends to carry my letter and card up, leaving me standing in the hallway, which I did not like, so I entered the first room I saw, and nearly fainted at the sight of a banquet on a table by the fire. Down comes Buttons, very insolent. No, oh no, his master is not at home, and in fact too busy to receive letters of introduction just now. The siege and many business difficulties I deliver. A kick to Buttons, pick up this chicken from the table, toss my card onto the empty plate, and addressing Buttons as a species of Prussian pig, march out with the honors of war." Trent shook his head. "I forgot to say that Hartman often dines there, and I draw my own conclusions," continued West. "Now about this chicken, half of it is for Braith and myself and half for Colette, but of course you will help me eat my part because I'm not hungry." "Neither am I," began Braith, but Trent, with a smile at the pinched faces before him, shook his head, saying, "What nonsense! You know I'm never hungry." West hesitated, reddened, and then slicing off Braith's portion, but not eating any for himself, said good night, and hurried away to number 470 Rue Serpente, where lived a pretty girl named Colette, orphaned after Sedan, and heaven alone knew where she got the poor roses on her cheeks, for the siege came hard on her. "That chicken will delight her, but I really believe she's in love with West," said Trent, and then walking over to the bed, "See here, old man, no dodging, you know. How much have you left?" The other hesitated and flushed. "Come, old chap," insisted Trent. Braith drew a purse from beneath his bolster and handed it to his friend with a simplicity that touched him. "7 sons," he counted. "You make me tired. Why on earth don't you come to me? I take it damned ill, Braith. How many times must I go over the same thing and explain to you that because I have money it is my duty to share it, and your duty and the duty of every American to share it with me? You can't get a cent, the city's blockaded, and the American minister has his hands full with all the German riff-raff and deuce knows what. Why won't you act sensibly?" I will, Trent, but it's an obligation that perhaps I can never even in part repay. I'm poor and, of course you'll pay me. If I were a usurer, I would take your talent for security. When you're rich and famous, don't, Trent. All right, only no more monkey business." He slipped a dozen gold pieces into the purse, and tucking it again under the mattress, smiled at Braith. "How old are you?" he demanded. 16. Trent laid his hand lightly on his friend's shoulder. I'm 22, and I have the rights of a grandfather as far as you're concerned. You'll do as I say until you're 21. The siege will be over by then, I hope, said Braith, trying to laugh, but this prayer in their hearts. How long? Oh, Lord, how long? Was answered by the swift scream of a shell soaring among the storm clouds of that December night. And that's where we're going to leave off tonight. We will pick back up with that same short story on Sunday. So I hope you will join me on Sunday as we continue reading The King in Yellow. Which story are we on? The Street of the First Shell. So yeah, thank you so much for joining me. I hope you have a good night and a good rest of your weekend, and I hope I'll see you on Sunday. Good night.